The Versailles Golden Cage. How Louis XIV used a luxury palace to trap and control dangerous French nobles. For more than 3 centuries, the Palace of Versailles has stood as one of the world's greatest symbols of beauty, luxury, and royal power. Millions of visitors walk through its magnificent halls each year, admiring glittering chandeliers, endless gardens, priceless works of art, and the famous Hall of Mirrors. It appears to be the perfect expression of wealth and elegance, a place where kings and queens lived surrounded by unimaginable splendor. Yet behind its golden walls lies a remarkable political story that is often overlooked. Versailles was far more than a magnificent palace. It was one of history's most sophisticated instruments of government. Every room, every ceremony, every garden path, and every carefully planned routine served a political purpose. The palace was designed not only to impress foreign ambassadors and celebrate the glory of France, but also to control the very people who had once threatened the authority of the French monarchy. The nobles of France had long been among the most powerful figures in Europe. Many ruled vast estates, commanded private armies, collected taxes from their lands, and enjoyed enormous influence over local populations. Some noble families had been powerful for centuries, long before the French monarchy became truly centralized. Although they owed loyalty to the king, they often pursued their own ambitions and were willing to challenge royal authority whenever they believed it served their interests. For generations, French kings struggled to keep these nobles under control. Rebellions erupted repeatedly. Powerful aristocrats formed alliances against the crown. Civil wars devastated regions of the kingdom. At times, the monarchy itself seemed close to collapse. When Louis XIV eventually became king, he inherited not only a vast kingdom, but also a dangerous political problem. He understood that military victories alone would never secure his throne. Executing large numbers of nobles could provoke even greater resistance. Granting them greater independence would weaken the monarchy. He needed another solution, one that would quietly transform the relationship between the king and the aristocracy without constant violence. His answer was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Instead of imprisoning his rivals behind stone walls, Louis invited them into a palace of extraordinary luxury. Instead of chains, he offered silk clothing, lavish apartments, elegant ceremonies, and the chance to stand close to the most powerful ruler in Europe. The nobles willingly accepted the invitation because refusing it meant losing influence, prestige, and access to royal favor. The palace itself became a carefully designed system of control. Noble families spent enormous fortunes simply maintaining their place at court. Their days became filled with elaborate rituals, endless competition for status, and constant efforts to gain the king's attention. While they competed against one another for small signs of royal approval, they had far less time, money, or opportunity to organize political resistance. Historians have sometimes described Versailles as a golden cage. Unlike a prison built of iron bars, this cage was constructed from luxury, ceremony, and ambition. Most of its prisoners never realized how effectively they had been confined. To understand how such an extraordinary system came into existence, it is necessary to travel back to a France that looked very different from the country most people imagine today. Before the glittering halls of Versailles, before Louis XIV became known as the Sun King, France experienced decades of fear, violence, uncertainty, and political instability. Those experiences shaped one young king whose personal memories would influence the course of European history. The story begins long before the palace itself was built. During the early 17th century, France was already one of Europe's largest and most populous kingdoms. Its fertile farmland, growing cities, and expanding trade gave it enormous potential. Yet beneath this appearance of strength lay deep political divisions. Power was spread among many competing groups. The king stood at the top of the political system, but local nobles exercised considerable authority within their own territories. Many aristocrats controlled castles, lands, courts, and armed followers. In practice, some regions operated with considerable independence from the royal government. This fragmented distribution of power created frequent tensions. When kings attempted to strengthen royal authority, nobles often resisted. They feared losing traditional privileges that had been inherited over generations. These privileges included exemptions from certain taxes, local judicial authority, hunting rights, and political influence within their provinces. Religion added another layer of instability. During the 16th century, France had been torn apart by the French Wars of Religion, a series of brutal conflicts between Catholics and Protestants. Entire towns changed hands repeatedly. Massacres shocked the population. Economic activity suffered as violence spread across the kingdom. Although King Henry IV eventually helped restore peace through the Edict of Nantes in 1598, religious tensions never disappeared completely. Suspicion remained between different communities, and political leaders often exploited these divisions for their own purposes. The monarchy also faced financial difficulties. Wars required enormous sums of money. Royal governments borrowed heavily and imposed taxes that angered many subjects. While peasants carried much of the tax burden, privileged groups often protected their own economic advantages. During the reign of Louis XIII, important reforms began to strengthen the monarchy. Much of this work was directed by Cardinal Richelieu, one of history's most influential statesmen. Richelieu believed that France could only become truly powerful if the authority of the king surpassed that of every noble family. His policies reflected this belief. He reduced the military independence of powerful nobles, weakened fortified castles that could serve as centers of rebellion, and expanded the authority of royal officials throughout the kingdom. He also limited the political power of Protestant strongholds while preserving certain religious protections established under earlier agreements. Richelieu's reforms significantly increased the strength of the French state, but they also created resentment among many aristocrats. Noble families who had once exercised broad local authority now found themselves increasingly subject to decisions made in Paris. While some accepted these changes, others waited for opportunities to resist. After Richelieu's death in 1642 and the death of Louis XIII the following year, France entered another period of uncertainty. The new king, Louis XIV, was only 4 years old. Because he was too young to govern, real power passed to his mother, Anne of Austria, who served as regent, and to her chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. Both sought to continue the centralizing policies established by Richelieu, but they faced growing opposition from nobles, judges, and members of regional governments. At the same time, France remained deeply involved in expensive European wars. Heavy taxation increased public dissatisfaction. Economic hardship affected both urban and rural populations. Political tensions continued to rise. The situation finally erupted into a series of conflicts known collectively as the Fronde. Beginning in 1648, these uprisings combined elements of civil war, political protest, and aristocratic rebellion. Different groups joined the movement for different reasons. Some opposed new taxes, others resisted the growing authority of the monarchy. Powerful nobles saw an opportunity to recover privileges they believed had been taken from them. The conflict spread across the kingdom for several years. For the young Louis XIV, the Fronde was not an abstract political event described in official documents. It was a frightening personal experience. Crowds entered Paris demanding political change. Armed forces moved through the countryside. Alliances shifted constantly. Even members of the royal family could not always be certain whom they could trust. On one occasion, angry crowds approached the royal residence while the young king was inside. Although he escaped physical harm, the experience left a lasting psychological impression. The image of political disorder, rebellious nobles, and uncontrolled mobs became deeply connected in his mind with personal danger. The royal family was forced to flee Paris more than once. Rather than living in security, the future king experienced uncertainty during some of the most formative years of his childhood. He witnessed how quickly authority could disappear when powerful groups united against the crown. The Fronde eventually collapsed because its leaders failed to cooperate effectively. Rivalries among noble families weakened the movement, while royal forces gradually regained control. By 1653, the monarchy had restored order. Yet Louis XIV never forgot what he had seen. He learned lessons that would guide his entire reign. He concluded that allowing powerful nobles to gather independently was dangerous. He believed that political disorder could spread rapidly if aristocrats accumulated enough influence outside the direct supervision of the king. Above all, he became convinced that royal authority had to remain unquestioned if France was to avoid returning to civil conflict. These memories did not simply shape his opinions. They shaped his strategy for governing one of Europe's greatest kingdoms. Years later, when Louis decided to transform a modest hunting lodge into the most magnificent palace on earth, he was not acting only out of personal taste or vanity. He was constructing a new political system. Its walls would be covered with gold instead of iron, its rooms filled with music instead of guards, and its guests would arrive willingly, believing they were entering the center of privilege. Few realized they were also entering one of history's most elegant instruments of royal control. By the time Louis XIV reached adulthood, France had emerged from years of political uncertainty. Cardinal Mazarin, who had guided the kingdom through the king's childhood, died in 1661. According to long tradition, many members of the court expected Louis to appoint another chief minister who would handle the daily business of government. Powerful nobles assumed that real authority would once again be shared among influential advisors. Instead, the 22-year-old king surprised everyone. Louis announced that he would govern personally. No chief minister would stand between the king and the machinery of the state. Every important decision would ultimately pass through him. It was a bold declaration, one that signaled the beginning of a new era in French history. This decision did not mean that Louis worked alone. France still relied on experienced ministers, administrators, military commanders, judges, and financial experts. Men such as Jean-Baptiste Colbert played essential roles in strengthening the economy, improving taxation, encouraging manufacturing, and expanding overseas trade. Skilled generals reorganized the army into one of Europe's most disciplined fighting forces. Engineers improved roads, canals, and fortifications throughout the kingdom. Yet Louis made certain that all of these talented individuals understood one principle above all others. They served the king, not themselves. Their influence depended entirely upon royal confidence, and that confidence could disappear at any moment. The challenge remained the same one that had haunted French monarchs for generations. How could a king ensure that the aristocracy never again became powerful enough to threaten the crown? Louis believed that political power depended not only upon armies and laws, but also upon proximity. Those who spent their time close to the king gained influence. Those who remained in distant provinces gradually lost it. If the greatest nobles could be persuaded to spend much of their lives near the monarch, instead of strengthening their own regional bases, the balance of power would shift permanently toward the crown. For this strategy to succeed, the king required more than an ordinary royal residence. He needed a place unlike any palace Europe had ever seen. The location Louis selected surprised many observers. About 20 kilometers southwest of Paris stood the small village of Versailles. It was not an ancient capital, an important trading center, or a place of great political significance. Instead, it contained a modest hunting lodge built during the reign of Louis XIII. The surrounding land consisted largely of forests, marshes, and gently rolling countryside that attracted deer and other game. The site possessed several advantages. Because Versailles had no long history as a political center, the king could shape it according to his own vision without competing against older traditions. The surrounding land offered enormous space for future expansion. Most importantly, Versailles lay close enough to Paris for communication and commerce while remaining far enough away to reduce the influence of the restless capital that had frightened Louis during the Fronde. The choice reflected practical calculation as much as personal preference. Construction began on an extraordinary scale. What had once been a relatively simple hunting lodge slowly disappeared within an ever-expanding complex of stone, marble, and gilded decoration. Thousands of workers arrived to reshape the landscape. Architects designed magnificent new wings. Engineers redirected water supplies across great distances. Artists, sculptors, painters, gardeners, and craftsmen collaborated on a project whose size amazed contemporaries. The transformation continued for decades. Louis did not simply commission a beautiful building. He oversaw the creation of an entire political stage upon which every aspect of royal authority could be displayed. Architecture became a language of power. The palace stretched outward with remarkable symmetry, reflecting ideals of order, balance, and control. Wide courtyards guided visitors toward the royal apartments. Endless rows of windows filled the structure with light. Expensive materials announced that the resources of the kingdom were concentrated around the monarchy. Inside, decoration carried carefully chosen messages. Paintings celebrated military victories, diplomatic successes, and the achievements of the king. Classical mythology appeared throughout the palace, comparing Louis to heroic rulers and powerful gods of the ancient world. The image of Apollo, the sun god, appeared repeatedly, reinforcing Louis's growing identification as the Sun King. The comparison was deliberate. Just as the planets revolved around the sun, Louis wished the political life of France to revolve around himself. Every noble, every minister, every court official, and every foreign ambassador would recognize that all authority radiated outward from the monarch. One room eventually became the most famous symbol of this vision. The Hall of Mirrors stretched more than 70 meters through the heart of the palace. On one side, tall windows overlooked the magnificent gardens. On the opposite wall, hundreds of mirrors reflected the sunlight entering from outside. At a time when large mirrors were exceptionally expensive to manufacture, their sheer number represented an astonishing display of wealth and technological achievement. When sunlight flooded the hall, the reflections created an almost magical atmosphere. Gold, crystal, marble, and polished glass combined to produce a dazzling spectacle unlike anything most visitors had ever witnessed. Foreign ambassadors often described the experience with amazement. Louis understood exactly what they were seeing. They were not simply observing luxurious decoration. They were witnessing a carefully staged demonstration of French strength, economic resources, artistic excellence, and royal confidence. Every impressive detail encouraged visitors to associate France with stability and grandeur under a single ruler. Beyond the palace itself stretched gardens that appeared almost endless. Designed primarily by André Lenotre, the grounds transformed nature into another expression of royal authority. Forests were cleared, hills were reshaped. Lakes, fountains, canals, terraces, and carefully trimmed trees extended across thousands of hectares. Nothing appeared accidental. Long, straight avenues directed the eye toward distant horizons. Trees stood in precise alignment. Flowers bloomed according to carefully planned arrangements. Water features operated through remarkably complex engineering systems that required enormous effort to maintain. The gardens carried an unmistakable political message. Nature itself seemed disciplined under the king's command. Visitors walking through Versailles encountered a world where every path, every fountain, every statue, and every carefully shaped hedge reflected order rather than disorder. It was the opposite of the chaos Louis remembered from his childhood. Building such a palace demanded extraordinary resources. Stone arrived from distant quarries. Timber was transported from forests across France. Marble came from several regions. Luxury fabrics, rare woods, precious metals, and artistic materials flowed steadily toward Versailles. The workforce expanded into the tens of thousands during periods of intense construction. Masons, carpenters, roofers, sculptors, painters, blacksmiths, gardeners, engineers, glassmakers, and laborers worked simultaneously across the growing estate. Conditions were not always easy. Workers endured harsh weather, dangerous equipment, heavy lifting, and strict deadlines imposed by the king's ambitions. Some projects required marshland to be drained before construction could begin. Others demanded the movement of enormous quantities of earth to create terraces and waterways. Despite these challenges, progress continued year after year. As the palace expanded, Louis gradually increased the amount of time he spent there. What began as a favored residence slowly developed into the true center of royal life. The decisive moment came in 1682. Louis officially transferred the royal court and the central machinery of government from Paris to Versailles. This decision changed far more than the king's address. Ministers established offices within or near the palace. Government officials followed. Members of the royal household relocated. Foreign ambassadors adjusted their diplomatic routines. Most importantly, the highest-ranking nobles increasingly found that their political futures depended upon regular attendance at Versailles. If an aristocrat wished to influence royal policy, secure military appointments, obtain pensions, arrange advantageous marriages, or request favors, remaining in a distant provincial estate became increasingly risky. The king was now at Versailles. Power was at Versailles. Opportunity was at Versailles. One by one, the great families of France arrived. Many initially viewed their presence as an extraordinary privilege. Apartments within the palace became highly desirable, despite often being surprisingly small by the standards of noble country estates. Simply living under the same roof as the king carried immense prestige. Yet there was an important difference between visiting Versailles and living there. Visitors could admire the palace and then return home. Residents entered an entirely different world. Every hour of the day followed carefully organized routines. Every ceremony reflected invisible rules. Every conversation might influence careers. Every gesture toward the king carried political meaning. The palace did not merely house the aristocracy. It absorbed them into a system where their ambitions, rivalries, and daily lives revolved around one individual. Many nobles believed they had come to serve the king. Gradually, they discovered that the palace itself had begun reshaping their habits, priorities, finances, and relationships. Without chains, without prison walls, and without visible force, Louis XIV had brought the most powerful families in France into a place where nearly every aspect of their public lives unfolded under his watchful eye. The golden cage was almost complete. Its doors remained open, its rooms glittered with luxury, and its residents considered themselves fortunate to be inside. Few yet understood how completely the balance of power within France had begun to change. By the early 1680s, Versailles had become much more than the official residence of the French king. It was now the political heart of the kingdom. Decisions affecting millions of people were made within its walls. Diplomats from across Europe waited anxiously for audiences with Louis XIV. Ministers carried reports from every province of France into the palace, while messengers departed with royal instructions that shaped military campaigns, financial policy, trade, justice, and foreign affairs. Yet the most remarkable achievement of Versailles was not architectural or artistic. It was psychological. Louis XIV had discovered that controlling ambitious people did not always require force. Often, it required understanding what they valued most. The French nobility valued honor, prestige, influence, and recognition. They wished to be seen as important. They desired closeness to the monarch because royal favor could transform fortunes, secure prestigious military commands, provide generous pensions, arrange advantageous marriages, or elevate entire families for generations. Louis turned these desires into instruments of government. Rather than demanding complete obedience through fear alone, he created an environment where nobles voluntarily competed for his attention. Every compliment from the king, every invitation, every smile, every conversation, and every public acknowledgement became valuable political rewards. This competition changed aristocratic behavior in subtle but profound ways. Instead of building alliances strong enough to challenge the monarchy, nobles increasingly competed against one another. Each family sought to appear more loyal, more refined, and more indispensable than its rivals. Energy that might once have fueled political conspiracies was redirected toward gaining royal approval. The palace itself encouraged this transformation. Unlike medieval castles designed primarily for defense, Versailles emphasized openness, ceremony, and visibility. Long galleries, wide staircases, public courtyards, and interconnected apartments ensured that court life unfolded before countless observers. Privacy existed, but it was limited compared with the great fortified residences that many nobles had once occupied on their own estates. At Versailles, people constantly watched one another. Who spoke with the king? Who received an invitation to supper? Who stood closest during an important ceremony? Who was invited to accompany the king on a hunt? Who received a new office or pension? Every detail attracted attention. Information spread rapidly through the palace. Servants carried stories from room to room. Courtiers exchanged observations during meals and social gatherings. Ambassadors carefully reported changes in favor to their own governments abroad. In this environment, reputation became a form of currency. Louis understood that public honor could be distributed just as effectively as money. One noble might receive permission to accompany the king during a walk through the gardens. Another might be invited to participate in a hunting expedition. A third might receive the privilege of carrying a ceremonial object during an official event. To modern observers, these distinctions may appear trivial. To 17th century aristocrats, they carried enormous significance. Each privilege demonstrated that the king recognized an individual's loyalty and standing. Others at court immediately noticed these signs of favor, and careers could rise or fall based upon such apparently minor gestures. The king rarely needed to explain his decisions. His actions spoke for themselves. If a noble found himself repeatedly excluded from important ceremonies, others assumed that royal confidence had weakened. Friends became cautious. Rivals grew bolder. Opportunities diminished. In contrast, those frequently seen near the king attracted admiration and influence. Their advice carried greater weight because others believed they possessed direct access to the monarch's thoughts. The result was a court where appearances held genuine political importance. Louis carefully regulated these appearances through ceremony. Daily life at Versailles followed an extraordinarily structured schedule. The king's day itself became a public performance governed by established rituals that emphasized his central position within the kingdom. Each morning began with the royal awakening, known as the lever. This was not simply the moment when Louis rose from bed. Instead, it unfolded through a sequence of carefully organized stages. Different groups of courtiers were admitted according to their rank and privilege. Some entered while the king still rested. Others arrived as he dressed. Additional nobles gained access only during later stages of the ceremony. The order of admission mattered greatly. Being permitted to witness even a small portion of the king's morning routine represented an honor granted only to selected individuals. Nobles competed intensely for these opportunities because they demonstrated intimacy with the monarch. Even seemingly ordinary actions acquired ceremonial importance. Handing the king a shirt, presenting gloves, or assisting with a garment could become prestigious responsibilities assigned only to those enjoying exceptional favor. To modernize, such duties might seem more appropriate for servants than aristocrats. At Versailles, however, proximity outweighed practicality. The closer one stood to the king, the greater one's political prestige. The same principle governed meals. Public dining ceremonies allowed courtiers to observe the monarch while reinforcing his unique position. Even when Louis ate, every movement emphasized hierarchy and royal dignity. Throughout the day, audiences, council meetings, religious observances, hunts, walks, entertainments, and official receptions followed carefully established patterns. The evening concluded with another formal ritual known as the couture, during which the king retired for the night under procedures as carefully regulated as those of the morning. These ceremonies consumed significant portions of each day. Critics sometimes dismissed them as extravagant displays of vanity. In reality, they served a practical political purpose. Every ceremony required attendance. Attendance required presence at Versailles. Presence at Versailles meant prolonged separation from provincial power bases. A noble spending months at court could not simultaneously oversee every aspect of distant estates, strengthen local political alliances, or organize regional opposition to the monarchy. Meanwhile, royal officials appointed by Louis administered the provinces with increasing efficiency. The balance of authority shifted almost unnoticed. The king did not abolish the nobility. He transformed its role. Instead of acting primarily as independent regional leaders, many aristocrats became courtiers, whose influence depended upon maintaining good standing within the royal household. Fashion contributed to this transformation as well. Versailles became Europe's leading center of style. Clothing reflected rank, wealth, and sophistication. Fine silk, velvet, lace, embroidered coats, jeweled accessories, elegant wigs, and carefully designed shoes became essential elements of court appearance. Nobles invested enormous sums simply to meet expectations. A garment worn during one important occasion might never be considered appropriate again. Tailors, jewelers, wig makers, shoemakers, and textile merchants prospered as aristocratic demand increased. Luxury became almost compulsory. No written law required extravagant spending. Social expectations accomplished the same result. Families that failed to maintain suitable appearances risked embarrassment and declining influence. Their rivals appeared more prosperous, more fashionable, and therefore, perhaps, more worthy of royal attention. The financial consequences were significant. Many noble households devoted astonishing portions of their income to clothing, ceremonies, entertainments, servants, horses, carriages, apartments, and gifts associated with court life. Some accumulated heavy debts. Ironically, this financial pressure often increased dependence upon the king. Aristocrats struggling with expenses frequently sought royal pensions, offices, or financial assistance. Their economic security became increasingly connected to continued favor at court. Louis had achieved another objective. The nobles remained wealthy by ordinary standards, but many found it difficult to finance independent political ambitions while supporting the costly lifestyle expected at Versailles. Entertainment also played a central role. The palace hosted concerts, theatrical performances, masked balls, fireworks, banquets, hunting parties, and elaborate festivals that attracted admiration throughout Europe. Leading composers, playwrights, musicians, dancers, and artists performed before audiences that included foreign diplomats as well as French aristocrats. These spectacles celebrated the glory of the monarchy while filling the calendar with activity. A busy court had less time for conspiracy. Beyond the formal entertainments, countless conversations filled the palace each day. News traveled constantly. Military victories, diplomatic negotiations, appointments, marriages, financial developments, foreign visitors. Every event became the subject of discussion. Louis benefited from this continuous exchange of information. He rarely needed a vast network of secret informants to understand the mood of his court. People revealed themselves naturally. Ambitious nobles sought attention by sharing news. Rivals exposed one another's weaknesses. Supporters defended their friends. Opponents criticized their enemies. By carefully listening and observing, the king acquired valuable knowledge about relationships, loyalties, and potential conflicts. Versailles functioned almost like a living political map. Every interaction revealed shifting alliances. Every ceremony displayed the current balance of favor. Every invitation carried meaning. Louis seldom acted impulsively. He understood that patience could strengthen authority. Rather than responding immediately to every dispute, he often allowed rivalries to unfold while preserving his own position above the conflict. Courtiers increasingly looked to him as the only person capable of resolving disagreements. In this way, the palace reinforced an essential lesson every day. No matter how wealthy, ancient, or distinguished a noble family might be, its future ultimately depended upon the king. The aristocracy had not lost its privileges. Many nobles continued to hold important military commands, administrative offices, and honorary positions. They remained among the wealthiest and most respected people in France, but their independence had quietly diminished. Without realizing it fully, they had become participants in a carefully designed political system where ceremony shaped ambition, luxury encouraged dependence, and daily routines strengthened royal authority. The golden cage required remarkably little force. Its walls were built from honor instead of stone, prestige instead of iron, and desire instead of fear. That was precisely what made it so effective. The brilliance of Louis XIV's political system lay in the fact that it appeared voluntary. The king did not order every noble family to abandon their estates and remain permanently at Versailles. Many aristocrats still owned magnificent castles, extensive farmland, forests, vineyards, and prosperous towns throughout France. They could, in theory, spend much of their time managing these possessions. In practice, however, the realities of court life made prolonged absence increasingly dangerous. Power flowed through Versailles. Every significant appointment, military promotion, pension, honor, and royal privilege passed through the palace. Important decisions were often influenced not only by written reports, but also by personal conversations. A noble who remained far from the king risked becoming invisible. In politics, invisibility could be costly. If two equally qualified candidates sought the same military command, the one regularly seen at court often enjoyed the advantage. If a governor's position became available, ministers naturally remembered the noble they had recently spoken with, rather than someone who had spent months in a distant province. If disputes arose over inheritance, taxation, or regional authority, those closest to the king frequently found their concerns heard first. No official rule stated that attendance guaranteed success, yet everyone understood that absence reduced opportunity. This understanding created one of the most powerful forms of pressure in the entire system. Families began organizing their lives around the rhythms of Versailles. Sons seeking military careers remained close to court. Fathers hoping to secure influential offices maintained apartments in the palace. Mothers negotiated marriages while participating in court society. Daughters learned the manners, etiquette, and accomplishments expected within the royal household. Generation after generation became tied to the world Louis had created. Competition grew more intense each year. Every noble family wished to distinguish itself from its rivals. Some displayed remarkable elegance in dress. Others hosted refined gatherings or demonstrated exceptional skill in dancing, music, literature, or conversation. Military service remained an important path to honor, while administrative competence earned the respect of ministers responsible for governing the kingdom. Yet regardless of individual talent, one truth remained constant. The king decided whose efforts deserved recognition. Royal favor, therefore, became the most valuable prize at court. Unlike wealth, which could be inherited, favor had to be earned continually. Yesterday's success offered no guarantee for tomorrow. A careless remark, an unfortunate political alliance, or simply falling from the king's attention could reduce a family's influence surprisingly quickly. Louis rarely needed to punish people dramatically. Neglect often proved sufficient. If invitations ceased arriving, if audiences became difficult to obtain, or if conversations with the king grew noticeably shorter, experienced courtiers immediately recognized the warning signs. Others noticed them as well. Reputation changed quietly but decisively. This uncertainty encouraged extraordinary caution. Nobles measured their words carefully. Public disagreements were often softened to avoid offending influential figures. Families invested considerable effort in maintaining good relationships, not only with the king, but also with ministers, members of the royal household, and individuals whose opinions might eventually reach the monarch. The atmosphere rewarded discipline. It also rewarded patience. Louis himself possessed remarkable self-control. Although capable of displaying warmth and generosity, he usually avoided revealing strong emotions in public. He expected those around him to demonstrate similar restraint. Court etiquette reflected this expectation. Every greeting followed established customs. Clothing corresponded to particular occasions. Seating arrangements reflected rank with remarkable precision. Even walking through certain parts of the palace involved observing rules that everyone was expected to understand. These customs may appear excessively formal to modern audiences, but they served an important political function. They reduced uncertainty. When every person's position within a ceremony was clearly defined, disputes over precedence became easier to manage. Nobles might still compete fiercely, but their competition unfolded within a framework designed and supervised by the monarchy. The king remained the final authority in every matter of rank. This reinforced his position repeatedly throughout each day. Meanwhile, changes were taking place far beyond the palace walls. For centuries, many noble families had exercised considerable authority over local affairs. They supervised justice within their lands, influenced taxation, maintained personal networks of loyalty, and often acted as the most powerful political figures within their regions. Under Louis XIV, these traditional patterns gradually weakened. The king expanded the authority of royal officials known as intendants. These administrators represented the crown throughout the provinces and reported directly to the central government. Their responsibilities included overseeing taxation, supervising justice, maintaining public order, and implementing royal policies. Unlike hereditary nobles, intendants generally owed their careers to royal appointment rather than ancient family connections. Their loyalty rested with the king. Because many powerful aristocrats spent increasing amounts of time at Versailles, these officials acquired greater practical influence in local administration. This transformation did not eliminate the nobility. Instead, it altered the balance of responsibility. Many aristocrats retained impressive titles and extensive property, but the daily operation of government became increasingly centralized. France slowly evolved into one of Europe's strongest examples of an absolute monarchy, where authority flowed from the crown through an expanding administrative system. Versailles played a central role in making this possible. While nobles attended ceremonies, hunts, concerts, and receptions, professional administrators strengthened the machinery of government across the kingdom. Some historians have argued that this represented one of Louis XIV's greatest political achievements. He reduced the likelihood of aristocratic rebellion without destroying the noble class itself. Indeed, many nobles accepted the new arrangement because it continued to provide prestige, influence, and opportunities for advancement. They still commanded regiments, served as ambassadors, advised ministers, and participated in royal government. What changed was the source of their authority. Increasingly, influence depended upon service to the king rather than independent regional power. The financial consequences of life at Versailles further reinforced this dependence. Maintaining an appropriate standard of living at court demanded extraordinary expense. Apartments within or near the palace required constant maintenance. Large households of servants had to be employed. Horses, elegant carriages, and elaborate clothing consumed enormous sums. Formal dinners, receptions, gifts, gambling, travel, and fashionable furnishings all contributed to growing costs. For families determined to preserve their reputation, reducing expenses proved difficult. Court society valued appearance. A noble who dressed too simply or entertained too modestly risked appearing less successful than rivals. Such impressions mattered because reputation influenced political opportunity. Many aristocrats therefore spent beyond their means. Income from estates did not always keep pace with rising expectations. Agricultural harvests varied from year to year. Regional economic conditions fluctuated. Debts accumulated. Some families sold property to finance their obligations. Others borrowed heavily. Many sought profitable royal appointments capable of supplementing declining incomes. The monarchy benefited from this situation in several ways. Financial dependence encouraged political loyalty. Nobles hoping to receive pensions or offices had strong incentives to maintain good relationships with the crown. At the same time, expensive court life reduced the resources available for independent military or political ambitions. It became increasingly difficult to finance rebellion while also maintaining the lifestyle expected at Versailles. Louis had effectively redirected aristocratic wealth towards supporting the culture of his own court. Luxury became another mechanism of control. The palace itself constantly reinforced this message. Every magnificent room reminded visitors of royal wealth. Every carefully organized celebration demonstrated the king's ability to command enormous resources. Every artistic masterpiece proclaimed that France, under Louis XIV, stood at the center of European civilization. Foreign ambassadors often carried these impressions back to their own courts. Many rulers admired what they had seen. Some attempted to imitate Versailles by constructing grand palaces of their own. They copied elements of French architecture, landscape design, etiquette, and ceremonial life. Yet reproducing the appearance of Versailles proved far easier than reproducing its political function. The palace succeeded because it formed part of a much larger system. Louis combined architecture, ceremony, administration, finance, military strength, diplomacy, and personal authority into a single strategy. Each element reinforced the others. The palace impressed visitors. Ceremonies emphasized hierarchy. Administrative reforms strengthened central government. Economic policies increased royal resources. Military victories enhanced prestige. Together, these achievements persuaded many contemporaries that France had become the leading power in Europe. Not everyone admired the system. Some observers criticized the enormous expense required to maintain Versailles. Others believed that excessive ceremony encouraged vanity rather than genuine public service. A number of nobles privately resented the loss of independence they had once enjoyed. Yet open resistance remained rare. The rewards of cooperation usually appeared greater than the risks of opposition. Perhaps that was Louis XIV's greatest accomplishment. He convinced many of the kingdom's most ambitious people that their personal success depended upon strengthening the very system that limited their independence. The golden cage had become self-sustaining. Its residents competed eagerly for positions within it, invested their fortunes in preserving their place inside it, and measured their achievements according to standards established by the king himself. Without realizing it, they had accepted a new definition of power. Power no longer meant commanding a distant province or maintaining a private network of loyal followers. Power meant standing close to Louis XIV, and only one man determined who would enjoy that privilege. By the end of the 17th century, Versailles had become the center of one of the most remarkable political systems in European history. The palace dazzled visitors with its beauty, but beneath the polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers lay an invisible network of observation, communication, and influence that helped Louis XIV maintain control over the French nobility for decades. Unlike many rulers throughout history, Louis did not rely primarily on widespread terror to secure his position. France certainly possessed courts, prisons, and laws capable of punishing treason, but the daily operation of Versailles depended far more on information than intimidation. The king understood an important truth about political life. People often revealed their intentions without realizing it. At Versailles, thousands of individuals lived and worked in close proximity. Nobles, ministers, military officers, diplomats, servants, artists, merchants, musicians, priests, and royal officials crossed paths every day. Conversations took place in galleries, gardens, dining rooms, private apartments, and reception halls. News traveled with astonishing speed. A rumor whispered in one corner of the palace might be discussed openly somewhere else before the day ended. Louis rarely needed to ask directly what was happening around him. Information naturally flowed toward the center of power. Ministers informed him about developments within their departments. Ambassadors reported the opinions of foreign governments. Military commanders described conditions at the front. Courtiers shared observations about changing relationships among influential families. The king listened carefully. One of Louis XIV's greatest strengths was his patience. He seldom rushed to judgment after hearing a single report. Instead, he compared information from multiple sources, looking for patterns rather than isolated incidents. If several trusted advisors independently described similar concerns about a particular noble, the king took notice. If reports contradicted one another, he often waited before acting. This deliberate approach reduced the risk of being manipulated by false accusations or personal rivalries. Versailles itself made careful observation remarkably easy. The palace was designed to encourage movement and interaction. Long corridors connected different sections of the building. Shared ceremonial spaces brought together individuals from every corner of the kingdom. Important events unfolded before large audiences rather than behind closed doors. As a result, behavior became highly visible. A noble who suddenly avoided court gatherings attracted attention. An ambassador spending unusual amounts of time with a particular family prompted questions. A minister whose influence appeared to be growing too quickly became the subject of discussion. No formal system of surveillance could have gathered information as efficiently as thousands of observant people pursuing their own interests. In many ways, the courtiers monitored one another. Competition encouraged vigilance. Every ambitious aristocrat paid close attention to the successes and failures of rivals. Every invitation, promotion, marriage, military appointment, and financial reward was carefully noticed. This constant awareness created an atmosphere where secrets were difficult to preserve. The king benefited enormously from this environment. Rather than standing outside the network, he occupied its center. Another important feature of Louis's rule was his careful management of access. Not everyone could speak with the king whenever they wished. Audiences were valuable opportunities. Receiving one demonstrated royal confidence. Waiting weeks for an appointment suggested that a person's importance had declined. Because access itself carried political value, Louis could influence behavior simply by adjusting who saw him and when. Sometimes a brief conversation lasting only a few minutes reassured a noble family of continued royal favor. At other times, delaying an audience sent a quiet but unmistakable warning. This method required subtlety rather than dramatic confrontation. The king rarely needed to raise his voice. His schedule communicated enough. Foreign diplomats quickly learned to interpret these signals. They observed where people stood during ceremonies, who accompanied the king during walks, who attended private dinners, and who appeared frequently in the royal apartments. These details helped ambassadors understand the shifting balance of influence within France. Many of the reports survive today, providing historians with valuable insight into the operation of Louis's court. While Versailles benefited the monarchy, its effects varied considerably among the nobility themselves. Some families flourished. Talented administrators earned positions within government ministries. Skilled military officers rose through the ranks of the expanding French army. Diplomats negotiated important treaties. Men of learning, artistic ability, or financial expertise found opportunities that might have been unavailable under a less centralized system. For ambitious individuals capable of adapting to court life, Versailles could become a place of remarkable success. Royal favor opened doors throughout the kingdom. Other nobles, however, struggled. Some disliked the rigid etiquette and endless ceremonies. Others found the financial demands overwhelming. Families with declining incomes often discovered that maintaining appearances consumed resources they could scarcely afford. A number of aristocrats preferred the independence of their provincial estates, but recognized that prolonged absence from court carried political risks. They faced an uncomfortable choice: remain at Versailles and accept growing dependence upon royal favor, or remain at home and risk becoming increasingly irrelevant. Neither option restored the independence their ancestors had once enjoyed. Even successful courtiers paid a price. Their lives became governed by schedules established by someone else. Ceremonies dictated daily routines. Political calculations influenced friendships. Public reputation demanded constant attention. Many spent years pursuing honors that depended entirely upon the king's approval. In this sense, the famous description of Versailles as a golden cage contained considerable truth. The cage glittered with wealth, music, art, and celebration. Yet it remained a cage because its residents rarely controlled the conditions of their own influence. Everything ultimately depended upon Louis XIV. The king himself worked tirelessly to preserve this balance. Contrary to the image of a ruler interested only in luxury, Louis devoted remarkable energy to government. He attended council meetings regularly, reviewed reports from ministers, examined military affairs, considered diplomatic correspondence, and supervised countless administrative decisions. Visitors sometimes underestimated the discipline behind the ceremony. The magnificent spectacles of Versailles occupied only part of the king's day. Much of his time involved careful administrative work. This dedication strengthened his authority. Courtiers recognized that Louis understood the details of government and expected high standards from those who served him. His reputation for hard work reinforced respect throughout the administration. The effectiveness of the Versailles system can be measured by one simple observation. During the long reign of Louis XIV, France experienced nothing comparable to the Fronde. There were local disturbances, religious tensions, tax revolts, and military challenges. But the great aristocratic rebellions that had once threatened the monarchy largely disappeared. The nobility continued to compete vigorously. They competed for offices instead of independence. They competed for influence instead of rebellion. They competed for proximity to the king instead of building rival centers of power. From Louis's perspective, this represented a remarkable political success. Yet no system is perfect. Versailles also produced weaknesses that became more apparent over time. Because so much authority depended upon one individual, the government relied heavily upon the abilities and energy of Louis himself. His long reign lasted more than 70 years, allowing the system to mature under consistent leadership. Future rulers would inherit the palace, but not necessarily his discipline, political skill, or commanding personal presence. The financial burden also continued to grow. Maintaining the palace, supporting the court, financing wars, and sustaining royal prestige required enormous resources. Although Versailles did not by itself create France's financial difficulties, it became one visible symbol of the immense expenses associated with absolute monarchy. Critics increasingly questioned whether such lavish displays could continue indefinitely. Some philosophers and political thinkers began arguing that government should rest upon broader participation rather than concentrating authority in a single ruler. These ideas would gain greater influence during the 18th century. Nevertheless, it is important not to judge Louis XIV solely through the lens of later events. Within the context of his own time, his achievements were extraordinary. He inherited a kingdom marked by memories of civil conflict. He left behind one of Europe's strongest and most centralized states. Versailles played an essential role in that transformation. It was neither merely a luxurious home nor simply an extravagant monument. It functioned as a carefully designed political machine. Every corridor encouraged interaction. Every ceremony reinforced hierarchy. Every honor rewarded loyalty. Every expense deepened dependence. Every day reminded the nobility that the source of power no longer lay scattered across hundreds of castles and provinces. It resided in one palace. And within that palace, it resided in one man. The golden cage had fulfilled its purpose. It had transformed rivals into courtiers, regional lords into servants of the crown, and centuries of aristocratic independence into a system centered upon royal authority. Few buildings in history have exercised so much influence over the political life of an entire nation. When Louis XIV died on September 1, 1715, Europe had lost one of its most influential rulers. He had occupied the French throne for more than 72 years, the longest confirmed reign of any major European monarch. During that time, generations had been born, grown old, and died knowing no other king. France had expanded its influence, fought numerous wars, shaped European fashion, set artistic standards, and established Versailles as the most admired royal court on the continent. The palace had become far more than a residence. It had become a symbol. Visitors arriving from Spain, England, the Holy Roman Empire, Russia, Sweden, Denmark, the Italian states, and many other countries often returned home deeply impressed. They admired not only the architecture, but also the remarkable discipline of the court, the efficiency of royal ceremony, and the confidence projected by the French monarchy. Many rulers attempted to imitate what they had witnessed. Across Europe, magnificent palaces began to appear that clearly reflected the influence of Versailles. Elaborate gardens, symmetrical architecture, ceremonial court life, and carefully organized royal residences became fashionable among ambitious monarchs eager to display their own authority. Yet, copying the appearance of Versailles proved easier than reproducing its success. The palace functioned effectively because it was supported by a much broader political system. Louis XIV possessed exceptional experience, remarkable discipline, and an unwavering belief that the monarchy should stand above every competing center of power. He spent decades refining the balance between ceremony, administration, diplomacy, and military leadership. Simply constructing a grand palace could not guarantee similar results. Some rulers invested enormous sums in lavish residences without achieving the same level of political stability. Others discovered that magnificent buildings could become expensive burdens if not supported by efficient government and sustainable finances. In France itself, the system Louis created continued after his death, but it gradually encountered new challenges. His great-grandson, Louis XV, inherited both the throne and the magnificent palace. Versailles remained the official center of royal life, and many of the ceremonies established by Louis XIV continued. Court etiquette remained elaborate. Ministers still worked from the royal residence, and the nobility continued to seek favor through attendance at court. However, circumstances had changed. Louis XV inherited institutions created by a remarkable predecessor, but he faced a different political environment. New generations of thinkers began questioning long-established ideas about monarchy, government, economics, and society. During the 18th century, the movement now known as the Enlightenment spread across Europe. Philosophers, writers, scientists, and political thinkers encouraged people to examine traditional institutions through reason rather than unquestioning acceptance. They debated the proper limits of government, the rights of individuals, religious tolerance, education, and justice. Some admired aspects of the French monarchy. Others criticized the concentration of power represented by Versailles. The palace increasingly became associated with privilege, hierarchy, and the unequal distribution of wealth within French society. Meanwhile, financial pressures continued to accumulate. France remained one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, but maintaining military strength, supporting overseas ambitions, financing diplomacy, and sustaining the royal court required enormous expenditures. Wars proved especially costly. Throughout the reign of Louis XIV, France had participated in several major conflicts, including the Dutch War, the War of the League of Augsburg, and the War of the Spanish Succession. These campaigns strengthened French influence in some respects, but they also demanded vast financial resources. The palace itself represented only part of the monarchy's overall expenses. Yet its magnificent appearance made it an obvious target for criticism whenever economic difficulties became more severe. Ordinary people rarely experienced the luxury displayed within Versailles. Most French citizens lived in villages and towns, working as farmers, craftsmen, merchants, laborers, or small traders. Their daily concerns centered upon harvests, employment, taxation, food prices, and local conditions rather than court ceremonies. As economic pressures increased during the 18th century, the contrast between royal magnificence and popular hardship became more noticeable. It is important, however, to avoid oversimplifying history. Versailles did not cause the French Revolution by itself. The revolution resulted from a complex combination of financial crisis, political conflict, social inequality, changing ideas, poor harvests, government debt, and many other factors that developed over decades. Nevertheless, the palace became one of the most recognizable symbols of the old political order. When the French Revolution began in 1789, crowds no longer viewed Versailles simply as an architectural masterpiece. Many saw it as the visible heart of a system they believed required fundamental change. In October of that year, thousands of demonstrators marched from Paris to Versailles. Their demands reflected growing frustration with food shortages, rising prices, and political uncertainty. The royal family eventually left the palace and returned to Paris. For the first time in more than a century, Versailles ceased to function as the active center of French government. The golden cage stood largely empty. Its political purpose had ended, yet the palace itself survived. Although many furnishings disappeared during the Revolutionary years, the buildings remained standing. Over time, changing governments recognized their immense historical and cultural value. Today, Versailles is preserved as one of the world's most important historical monuments. Visitors admire its architecture, gardens, fountains, sculptures, paintings, and carefully restored interiors. Historians continue studying the palace because it offers extraordinary insight into politics, art, economics, engineering, architecture, and social life during one of Europe's defining periods. The lessons of Versailles extend far beyond 17th century France. Louis XIV demonstrated that power does not always depend primarily upon military force. Influence can be exercised through institutions. It can be strengthened through carefully designed routines. It can be reinforced by architecture, ceremony, prestige, and social expectations. The king recognized that human ambition could become an instrument of government. Instead of eliminating the nobility, he redirected its ambitions. Instead of attempting to destroy aristocratic pride, he attached that pride to service within the monarchy. Instead of ruling only through fear, he combined admiration, opportunity, competition, and carefully distributed rewards. This approach influenced political thinkers for centuries. Modern historians often describe Versailles as an early example of soft power operating within domestic politics. The palace persuaded rather than merely compelled. It encouraged cooperation by making participation attractive. Its residents believed they were pursuing personal advancement. At the same time, they strengthened the authority of the crown. This does not mean Louis XIV ruled without coercion, or that his government never used force. France remained an absolute monarchy capable of enforcing its laws and defending its interests through military power. Yet Versailles illustrates that successful governments often combine multiple forms of authority rather than relying upon one alone. The palace represented culture, wealth, prestige, administration, symbolism, and politics working together. Its influence reached beyond France. Royal courts across Europe borrowed elements of French etiquette. Architects copied its style. Garden designers adapted its principles. Diplomats studied its ceremonies. Fashion, language, literature, music, and artistic tastes associated with Versailles spread throughout the continent. French became the preferred language of diplomacy among many European elites for generations. Versailles contributed to this cultural influence by presenting France as the leading center of refinement and sophistication. Even today, political leaders continue to recognize the importance of symbolism. Government buildings are carefully designed. National ceremonies are planned with precision. State visits follow detailed protocols. Official residences communicate messages about authority, continuity, and national identity. While modern democracies differ profoundly from the monarchy of Louis XIV, the relationship between political power and public image remains significant. In this sense, the story of Versailles continues to offer valuable insights. It reminds us that governments shape perception as well as policy. Buildings influence behavior. Ceremonies communicate values. Prestige affects decision-making. Symbols matter. Looking back across more than 300 years, it becomes clear that Versailles was never simply an extravagant palace built to satisfy one king's vanity. It was a calculated response to a lifetime of memories. The frightened child who had fled Paris during the Fronde grew into a ruler determined that no group of nobles would ever again possess the opportunity to threaten the stability of the French crown. Rather than filling prisons with aristocrats, he invited them into magnificent apartments. Rather than surrounding them with chains, he surrounded them with luxury. Rather than forcing obedience through constant violence, he encouraged dependence through honor, ceremony, and ambition. Many accepted the invitation willingly. They competed eagerly for places within the royal household, invested fortunes in maintaining their status, and devoted their talents to securing royal favor. The palace became their world. Its glitter concealed its purpose. That is why historians continue to describe Versailles as a golden cage. Like all effective cages, it restricted freedom without always appearing to do so. Its walls were built from privilege instead of stone. Its locks were fashioned from ambition instead of iron. Its guards were ceremony, etiquette, reputation, and the irresistible desire to remain close to power. Louis XIV understood something that many rulers before him had failed to grasp. The strongest prison is often the one whose occupants believe they have entered by choice. That insight transformed a quiet hunting lodge outside Paris into one of history's most influential centers of political power. Centuries later, the Palace of Versailles remains one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. But beyond its glittering mirrors, magnificent gardens, and golden decorations, lies an even more remarkable legacy. It stands as a reminder that power is not measured only by armies, laws, or wealth. Sometimes, the most enduring victories are won by shaping human ambition itself.